Recording. So thank you everyone for joining Humentum's webinar on operationalizing locally led development. This is one in our ongoing series, and we are very excited to be hosting this one on innovative financing. We will introduce all of our speakers in a moment, but you can see their names here on the screen. And we are very excited for today's webinar. So before we get started, I am going to go over a few brief housekeeping items, and then we will get started. So first, I would like to thank all of Humentum's industry partners. You can see our full list here, and then I will drop a link into the chat where you can learn more about them, but they provide amazing services and products to our entire sector and our community. And then I would like to remind everyone of our final webinar in this series on where do we go next. That will be on November 2nd. So we look forward to as many of you joining us there as possible. And then our members have access to roundtables and other benefits, which you can learn more about after this webinar. So that is it for those slides. I'm going to stop sharing and then I will go over our housekeeping. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we do have subtitling available. If you would like to have that on or off, you can turn it on or off by clicking the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then it should say live transcript or subtitles, and you can click enable or show, and then hide if you would not like to see those. We are recording the webinar, so all of you will receive the recording and a follow-up email later this week. And if you have colleagues who are not able to attend but registered, they will also receive an email at the same time. We do ask that you put your questions or comments in the chat. There are a wonderful number of you here on the call today, and to make sure that it's all manageable, we request that you put those into the chat and we will respond to them as we go. We will not have any slides, so there won't be slides shared, but the recording, as I said, will be shared with everyone. If you have a technology problem or a question that you would like to ask anonymously, you can send that to me by clicking on my name, Jessica Walker, in the chat box, and I will submit that question on your behalf. But we hope that everyone feels comfortable having an open and engaged dialogue with our panelists and with one another in the chat. So with that, I am very excited to hand it over to Humentum CEO, Christine So, who will kick us off.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today, and a big welcome and thank you to our panelists. As Jessica said, this is one event in a series of events that we have been sponsoring around operationalizing locally led development. So really thinking about the practical aspects of how we make the aspirations that we have around locally led development a reality. Today we'll be talking about innovative financing, which in and of itself is a really interesting, hot, dynamic topic. But in the context of locally led development, I think is really an area that we are still exploring and are interested in thinking through and seeing how it is being used to promote locally led development and, again, really operationalize it and make it a reality. We've got a great panel of 4 leaders in this area. I'm just going to mention them here, and I'm going to invite you to look online to get more information about them. We really want to use the time that we have together in discussion rather than me reading biographies that you can find elsewhere. So Chidi Koldsweat, who's the founder and CEO of Donors for Africa Foundation. Welcome, Chidi. Elina Sarkisova, who's the Senior Manager in Innovative Finance for Resonance. Jenny Hodgson, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and Charlie Benjamin, who's the former President and CEO of the Near East Foundation. And so again, welcome, and let's get to it. Also, actually, before I start, just want to reiterate, this will be a discussion and a conversation. I invite everybody on the webinar to put your comments and questions in the chat, as Jessica said, because we will be referring to it throughout the course of the event and trying to pull from the chat to inform our discussions. So this will hopefully be a dynamic conversation, and we count on all of you who are participating but are not panelists to really be inspiring and contributing to our discussion. So with that, I just want to switch over to the context in which we're talking about innovative finance, and what in the world is innovative finance? We are really looking at ways that funding can be used different from the way it's been historically channeled to the development and humanitarian assistance sectors. And so, you can think of a traditional way that funding has been channeled through either government donors or foundations, where they, give grants, and then the recipient of the grant executes on the grant and provides reports on how the money has been used. Typically, that historic and traditional approach is very time-bound, a 3-year project or a 5-year project with a project budget ceiling. And so what we are looking at today is what are some of the approaches that are being developed, both independent of the global development and humanitarian assistance sectors, and also within the sector itself. So are we taking things from outside and adapting them, or are we developing approaches within global development that really take different starting points, that may look at timing differently, so not necessarily time-bound projects, that look at financial flows differently, that look at a different incentive structure to the incentive structure that has traditionally existed in a pure kind of contracts and grants approach. Looking at different funders. So are we bringing in funders that are not necessarily just government funders or established foundations, but looking at grouping of small donations, looking at non-traditional funders, for example, from the private sector, bringing them in. So all of these are the components that we're looking at that are considered within the innovative financing approach. And then there are different products, finance products, that have been created and are being explored and shared and replicated and scaled. And these can include some of the microfinance investment funds that we've seen launched, impact investment funds, development impact bonds, conditional cash transfers, crowdfunding, voluntary contributions. These are all different ways of funding work that is being carried out in ways that are different from how it's been handled traditionally. Today, we're really thinking about, as we go beyond this, are these innovative approaches helping us rethink or think differently about how locally led development can use these approaches to achieve higher impact, to have greater sustainability, to empower or fuel locally led organizations to be more autonomous actors in their own spaces. And I think the jury may still be out on a lot of this. So we're still doing a lot of learning, and we're going to look forward to hearing from our panelists about their thoughts on these approaches, what's working and what may not be working. And is the juice worth the squeeze? Is there real benefit in going into these innovative approaches? Why are they important? And what are some of the experiences that our panelists have had? So with that, I am going to open it up to the panelists. I'm going to pick on Chidi to get us started. So Chidi, welcome. And let me ask you from your perspective, why is it important to explore and develop innovative financing approaches, especially in the context of local development? Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine and everyone. It's a pleasure being here. So for us, it's key that we begin to revisit the way we are currently financing development, especially here in Africa, because we cannot consistently depend on external funding to run our operations. And, you know, I tell the nonprofits that we work with across Africa that there's a donor fatigue setting in. People or funders are getting used to funding the organizations they've already trained and trusted over the years. They don't want to have to go through that process of reconducting a new due diligence to identify new organizations. So because of that, uncertainty in the sector, you want to ensure that you're very, very innovative about the way you approach financing and the way you are generating funds for your nonprofit, so that your solutions are sustainable and they are scalable and they can be replicated over a long period of time. So I think that's one reason why innovative financing has become such a big deal with the nonprofits that we work with.
Thanks, Chidi. Yeah, and I think that Chidi has gotten us started in a great way, because she's also, I think, introduced this idea that looking at innovative solutions from the perspective of a locally led organization, really coming up with its own innovative solutions that it is driving to strengthen its own sustainability. So there are different perspectives that we can take to look at this. Let me ask Charlie, can you speak a little bit about how you've been involved in this, but also thinking about that, where does the solution start and how is it actually driven?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, and I'm really happy to be part of the panel. Yeah, so that's an interesting question where it starts. I think that it's a really exciting time right now. There are a lot of conversations. There's a lot of collaboration among diverse partners to try to find new solutions, new business models. From my perspective, an elevated focus on evidence, rigor, what works, and how to scale it up. Right. So we're working with new donors, new business models, attention to sustainability and impact in a new way, value for money. And I think the point that you made, Christine, about getting beyond traditional project cycles is really an important point here. And I think everybody is looking for new ways of doing business, building in flexibility, contingency planning, longer time horizons. And the work that I've been involved with in innovative finance has really mostly started with what we see as successful projects that are backed up by hard evidence about impact, and looking for ways to sustain these activities in the absence of external donors, and to scale up in a way that may not be possible with project-based funding. So that's a good. And if I can I just add a point?
Sure.
So I'm most of the work that I'll refer to is comes from my time with the Near East Foundation. I stepped down as CEO at the beginning of July. So I know that the work there has continues, and they're doing really, really exciting stuff. So I might slip into we and they but just to know that I'm speaking from my own perspective, my own experience. But I would highly recommend that folks pay attention to what NEF is doing. And there's some really exciting things in the works. But anyway, so that's Christine, if that answers the question.
Sure, it gives us more to consider. Thank you. Right. I think one thing that I've heard both Chidi and Charlie refer to is the idea that we can't depend on traditional donors to continue to provide funding in the way that they have. And so this is also a way to be looking at what are other contingency ways to get funding. And I would say, you know, again, thinking about what's driving the development of the innovative financing is probably also a greater desire for autonomous decision-making at the level of the implementer and being able to implement for themselves. Let me turn it over to Jenny and ask you to come in here with your thoughts on what you've heard so far.
Sure, thank you, Christine, and hello, everybody. I suppose I'm Jenny Hodgson. I'm with the Global Fund for Community Foundations, which has been on the forefront of the Shift the Power movement, which I would say comes from the demand side of systems change, if you like. I think there's a lot of discussion amongst NGOs and funders on the supply side about what needs to be done differently. And our work has really been focused on fostering conversations at local, national, regional level about the system that people want, that communities want, the need to be able to drive, for communities to drive their own development and so forth. And I mean, Chidi talked about donor fatigue. I think we are also working on recipient fatigue, that people are just fed up with the same old ways of doing things and then constantly feeling like they're trying to operate within systems in which they can't possibly perform effectively. So our focus has really been on two areas. We don't use the language of innovative financing, but I suppose it is. It's also the kind of oldest financing that there's ever been, which is communities have always worked to help each other, and systems of solidarity and mutuality have always existed. And yet these have been consistently overlooked by the development system. Communities have seen as having scarcity and a lack of resources. So the framing that we use is to look at a blending of resources, which include local resources, including local financial resources, but other kinds of capital, relational capital, trust, knowledge, and such like. And to start to think about the relative value of different kinds of resources. So international aid money is usually rather chilly money. It comes from far away on a contractual basis. Local resources, when they are organized and brought together by and for and with community, are warm resources. They're based on people wanting to do things together for the good of their community. So our approach to this has been to sort of see the innovation as a reframing in which we can actually have a wider lens, where the focus of the analysis isn't just the flow of funds from north to south, but really a much broader appreciation of the different kinds of resources that must drive development and that center communities' rights, equity, justice, dignity at their heart. And that is the starting point in which other actors should be in service of, if you like.
So thank you, Jenny. I think those are great concepts to be introduced here. And I know I was nodding my head, and I think probably a lot of other people were. I love also the idea that when we're talking about innovative financing, you know, that chilly money versus warm money, and the idea that financing is a resource, but there are so many other resources that can be brought to bear when we're talking about innovative approaches. Elina, let me hand it over to you and get your reactions to this first part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to kind of build on what Jenny has, started to allude to, which is the kind of different flavors of money, right? To me, the case for innovative finance is kind of simple, right? We're trying to solve some of the world's most toughest, most complex problems. Some would call, wicked problems, using a very limited set of tools. When you call your plumber to fix a leaky faucet, you don't expect them to just show up with a wrench, right? You want them to come with a whole toolbox and be ready to address any number of scenarios, right? But we don't treat development in that way. As Christine, as you had said in the beginning, on the one spectrum, on one side of the spectrum, we've got kind of grant capital, which, there's no expectation of a financial return, only a social return. It's typically very short term and prescriptive. It's great for problems that are like linear and have very clear solution sets, which, you know, let's face it, that's kind of the exception, right, in development, not the rule. And then on the other hand, you've got kind of profit maximizing commercial capital, typically debt, equity, whose time horizons, financial return expectations also don't meet the needs of the vast majority of businesses operating in developing countries. And so to me, innovative finance is kind of a way to close that gap, right? It's a way to expand the toolbox for solving the world's toughest problems. It's about moving from kind of these one-size-fits-all solutions to instruments and financing strategies that really fit the local context.
So thanks for that. I think that one of the questions that we run into a lot around innovative financing is that so much of it is either a one-off experiment, or there's an, you know, we're going to try this approach out, it's a pilot, or there are several pilots, but we have to do a lot of learning. And, you know, oh, we're doing a lot of learning right now, so we've got really high transaction costs, but once we get to, you know, the next phase, it's going to be a lot more affordable. You know, how do we move from this period of learning to a period of actually scaling up? And I think one of the questions, and we're seeing this a bit in the chat, and I think Jenny referred to it, is this also has an investment cost. And, you know, small organizations, local organizations typically don't have extra reserves. They don't have unrestricted funding that they can be putting into these learning experiences. And how do we bridge the gap between you know, coming up with these new things that can actually respond to the real challenges that we know exist, and at the same time actually enable those who are most affected by the financing challenges to be part of that solution? I'm just going to circle it back to Chidi. What do you think about that, Chidi?
So for me, I think if we're looking to bridge the gap between the existing financing that we've had, you know, in the previous years, one of the things that we have been doing at Donors for Africa is when we interact with some of our donors and they say, oh, nonprofits can't be trusted, you know, they have internal issues and all these issues. We spend time training our nonprofits. And one of the things that have come out from that experience is that we've now developed a pool of over 3,000 nonprofits that can be trusted across Africa. And what we've done with that pool is when we are engaging with the private sector, we are saying your CSR funds that goes into your marketing campaign, your branding and visibility campaigns, let us help you rechannel those resources into working with trusted nonprofits that you had, you know, claimed weren't available, and we would keep track of the progress they are making. And you know, it's interesting to note that these nonprofits have access to most of the regions that these organizations want to gain access into. They're already doing the work that you're interested in financing, but we have just provided the technical expertise. So at the end of the day, we are having more private sector companies now willingly funding their CSR projects, not just assigning it to the regular branding and visibility anymore, but it's now being channeled into, you know, organizations who are actually doing the work on the field, and they can keep track of the results. So I think a great way that we can, you know, continue to bridge this gap is to begin to explore maybe uncommon avenues where the money is coming from, or resources that people have available. But let me not say they don't know what to do with that resources, but we can just help them rechannel those resources to be more impactful while working with the organizations who are dealing with some of these challenges.
Thanks, Chidi. I think that's so important. And actually, I mean, we've spent some time in this discussion series talking about partnerships of consequence and the movement towards trust-based partnership and compliance. And I think that's everything that you're just speaking to here. So it's not just a matter of kind of having organizations off on their own, thinking through how they're going to try and do this, but it's really working to strengthen capacity to build we are at this level, we are ready to go. And that helps build that trust with new donors and different kinds of donors in the way that you just spoke about. Jenny, do you want to jump in here about, from your very community-based perspective and build on what Chidi was just talking about?
I will try.
Or anything else. Sorry, I'm keeping you on your toes.
No, let me go. So, one of the issues we're struggling with just generally is this tension between the power hose of top-down development, which has money to burn and a short-term time frame where things need to perform immediately, and the reality of how complex social change really happens, and the idea of emergent systems and networks. And I would say, we've been working for the last 16 years with networks of local funds and foundations, accompanying them to grow at the pace they want to grow. And their core locus of trust for them is trust at the local level, to be trusted by others, to build trust between others. And so sometimes we forget that it's not just, we focus on trust between funders outside and local actors, but actually the currency of social change is trust, is collective action, is people working together, working in sort of participatory democratic cultures where people believe that others are going to do what they say they're going to do, kind of thing. And so we know we have an impatient system with a lot of money to burn, and an emergent system which has a much longer time frame, which allows for somebody to be asked if they want to give a kind of local philanthropic contribution one day and maybe think about it for 3 years and come back and say, I'm ready now, kind of thing. So we know we have to embrace the fact that we have a train that's running very fast, and a train that's running in a much more sort of slow, organic, watering can rather than power hose kind of way. I think one of the spaces that I see the sort of innovative financing sort of language thrown around a lot is in the climate space, where we know the rhetoric is we need to get money to those who are most effective, who know the most about it, who can directly apply, the resources in the most effective way. And we recently actually did a piece of research trying to unpack some of this language for some of the partners we work with, who are saying, we don't understand, it's so impenetrable, the language is new, it's a different discourse, it's a different rhetoric. Is it real? Should we go for it? Or is it just another way to sort of dress up the old system where the logic forces the creation and the role of intermediaries, that other people act as the translators, and it's always kept away from the kind of community level. So I think we have to acknowledge that there are, we are talking about sort of dominant and emergent systems, supply and demand, but also that there are kind of power structures in this where it does benefit those in the system who've been working for a long time to kind of create reasons why it should be so difficult. And I think sometimes we work with a rather narrow framing rather than one that says, actually, how do we build these pathways between the appetite in the dominant system to really do things differently and the appetite in an emergent system to be positioned to do something similarly too? How do we create the new alliances, the new experimentations? And maybe we need to be looking at experimentations across those different parts of the system, rather than experimenting in one part of it and then expecting it to have a trickle-down effect into another. So I feel like it's the crossing of the boundaries that this sector has not always been very good at, that we really need to kind of build on.
Thanks, Jenny. I think that's so important, and bringing the idea of power structures and power dynamics into this. Again, it comes back to the ideas around trust, around partnerships. Elina, could I ask you to think about the experiences that you've had working on some of these innovative financing approaches, and talk a little bit about how those partnerships may have been structured, and maybe what works and what doesn't, what you've seen work and what you've seen not work.
Sure, I'll try. That's a big question.
Well, again, anything else you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think picking up on sort of this theme of how do you scale, right? That we've seen this like pilotism, right? There's all these pilots, but we haven't really seen any significant scale of any specific instrument. And I think it's partly because it takes innovative finance is a new way of doing business, right? And so you need new systems and processes. You need, to Chidi's point, capacity building to be able to build the pipeline of potential investments. You need effective matchmaking. You need to aggregate demand so that you don't have to just go from donor to donor to donor, right? Kind of asking if they'll invest in this instrument versus that instrument. You need basically an ecosystem, right? You need an efficient market, and that's kind of what we're missing, and most of my experience comes, is in the development impact bond space. And we're starting to see that, we've got a decade of experience now where we've done all these one-off pilots. And so, I think the community is coming together and saying, okay, how do we actually create an efficient market for these instruments? And a part of that is doing a lot of the boring work that no one wants to do, which is a lot of the ecosystem building, like building technical assistance facilities that try to work with organizations on getting them ready to receive investment through an impact bond structure. And so we're starting to see, we're definitely starting to see that through a proliferation of outcomes funds. So essentially donors coming together and pooling their money as a way to aggregate demand. We're also seeing, there was a recent launch of the Outcomes Accelerator that was funded by the UK, the Swiss, and UBS Optimus Foundation, which is focused more on the capacity building of building a pipeline of investments. So we're starting to see that, but we need more of that. We need more people focused on creating efficient markets.
And I think you're so right about this idea that you need to develop the ecosystem. You have to have the structures that support it. You want to look for the aggregation. You want to look for the consolidation and the efficiencies, and then how you will move from the one-off pilots to doing this at scale. A hard question: is it worth the investment? Are we seeing enough benefit of doing things differently coming out of the investment in all of these experiments to say, yes, this is something that we should invest in to scale up? I guess I'm asking Elina, but I'll
okay.
ask others to jump in as well, because this is not
I'll just throw something out there. I think it depends. As a diplomatic response to a complicated question, I think it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. I think with regard to impact bonds, for example, I think we have enough evidence now that if you're going for revenue diversification, crowding in new money, that, dibs aren't good for that. No, it's not worth the effort. You're probably better off going the traditional grant route. It's a lot less work and it's a lot more money. If you're looking for ways to instill a performance culture and change management and a more sustainable way of working, absolutely. So I think it's a more nuanced question of why are you engaging in innovative finance, and what are you really trying to get out of it? Are you trying to amplify your impact? Are you trying to change your internal culture and systems to be more adaptive and innovative? Are you just trying to get, to kind of wean yourself off the donor funding and kind of diversify your funding resources? So essentially, it kind of depends.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Charlie, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, well, so is it worth the effort? I think that that is a great point that Elina made. That it depends on what you're looking for, but it also depends. I think, well, the diversity of situations that impact bonds can be applied is, if you just look across the board at what, the kinds of impact bonds that are out there, they're across many different sectors. Some sectors I think are more difficult than others to structure. There are, new and diverse partnerships where people speak different languages, have different regulatory requirements, different expectations. So there's a process of aligning expectations and procedures. And so I think that for me, it depends on the process and what you're looking to get out of the process. Because I think that what's happening is that it's triggering innovation, it's triggering problem solving. So I don't know that a development impact bond is, of 2022 is going to be the same as the solution in 2025. But what I see, the discussions that are happening right now, there's a real good faith effort to learn, to innovate, and to offer new ways of doing business to NGOs and development actors. I think that there needs to be a lot of attention, and so it's one thing, is the innovative finance interesting for an international NGO or others, operating at an international level. Whether they're interesting from a locally led development perspective is a different question altogether, right? I think that and I think that there are ways of structuring these things so that it does encourage and facilitate locally led development. For me, a development impact bond, and Elina knows the development impact bond, the refugee impact bond that the Near East Foundation was involved with. For the Near East Foundation, it opened up a new time horizon for doing work. It created a sense of flexibility and problem solving and implementation. So there were clear expectations of metrics that, and I should say are clear expectations of metrics that need to be met. But within that, there's a whole structure for adaptive management that allows innovation and learning in implementation. And I'm sure that lessons are going to come out of that. But there needs to be a real attention to the learning process, the dialogue, the documentation, and model building. I mean, if these high transaction cost approaches are going to benefit the broader community of development actors, particularly local development actors, then the models need to be accessible. I mean, the funders, that's great. The funders need to be there and accessible and willing to work with diverse partners. But the models themselves need to be of a complexity that can be managed by different types of development actors for them to be relevant.
Thank you, Charlie. Chidi, let me come back to you. And from your perspective, how are you all thinking about results-based funding? Is that something that you see as having a lot of potential? The idea that you're paying for results, but there's flexibility within the way that the funding flows and is used. Are there other more flexible instruments that you're thinking about?
Okay, so the concept of results-based financing is great, right? Because it has a way of also, motivating these nonprofits to push through and deliver results. However, to me, it's two-sided because first off, the nonprofit needs to have enough capital, like Jenny mentioned, to be able to even finance that project from start to the point where they can deliver the results. Now, we already know the realities of even dealing with tranche-based financing, where you're giving funding based on, milestones and KPIs. There's already a challenge with that because there's just so many varying factors. So let me come back to the initial question. I love the concept of result-based financing. However, I also question what sort of organizations are they looking to deliver such results? Do they have the capacity to deliver those results? Because that's the reality of these nonprofits you work with. They can't do the work when they have the capital-based financing coming in. But if they have to wait until they deliver the results before we can say we can go ahead and finish financing the process, it also has its issues. So I would just say there has to be a blended approach. Back to what Jenny said, I think there has to be a blended approach and understanding the unique needs of the varying organizations that are in question. For example, I do know of a nonprofit we have worked with. They received capital-based financing, and now she has gone on to increase her resource base from $300,000 to $700,000, reaching over 10,000 women within a 1-year time frame. just because she had that initial capital to kick off and deliver the results that you're looking to see. So I think there has to be a blended approach towards how best or who qualifies for result-based financing and who qualifies for capital-based financing. I think there has to be a blended approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's you laid that out so well that, you know, this idea you can come up with an instrument that seems to be accessible, but unless you make sure that there aren't barriers to access, it's not going to actually reach the organizations that it could benefit the most. Let me go to Jenny, and can you build on this idea around blended approaches? And I mean, you've talked already a little bit about the other resources that we can consider that go beyond just the financial resources, but you know, from your perspective, how do you think about results-based funding, results-based approaches, and then that blended resources question?
Sure. So I have to say, I'm not familiar with much of this jargon. I mean, surely everything is results-based. So I know it's a thing, and it's a, you know, there are amongst many other things. I mean, for me, I'm quite literal. It's like, you know, if it looks like a result and a community thinks it's a result, it's a result. So I would say the issue with results-based finances is whose results defined by whom, you know, and I think that goes back to the ultimate thing. We can't keep coming in with sparkly, shiny things designed on the other side of the world and expect them to work. You know, good, you know, in the work of that we do as the Global Fund for Community Foundations, our purpose is really to invest in ecosystems in which civil society is robust, trusted, legitimate, locally supported. And that idea of capacity, and I think somebody mentioned it further up in the blog, the idea of who defines what capacity is or isn't is critical. So I think our whole approach is sort of reversing back into some of these larger international aid conversations with a kind of, what does it need to look like for the people it's most effective, and how can others be in service of that, and how can they see their resources as one input into that? So across the world, you know, we use small grants as a way to identify and work with local funds and foundations that really are experimenting around the ideas of local giving, the reawakening of the awareness that people have always invested in their own development in different ways, and an attempt to sort of try and modernize and grow that, to say, if we can give this much to the church or for a funeral or for a self-help group, what happens if we start to design structures which are imbued with this spirit of mutuality and giving? And trust is a critical dimension. And we know then that external money coming at speed, and it could be in the context of a mine being built in a community or a big grant, undermines trust. And somehow we don't seem to be able to see the kind of negative impacts of different kinds of resources coming in and how they can undermine what's already there. So for us, this sort of blending is, you know, there are good people, good structures, good resources in different parts of the system, but they often don't seem to find each other. In fact, the system seems to be designed to identify organizations that look like what they need to look like for a funder to give them money. And I think that's a critical issue in all of this. If we're talking about locally led development, is the issue that after all these decades of international development aid, civil society organizations have got very good at looking like what they need to look like to access international money. And they are not very good at looking like what they need to look like to build local constituencies for their work. You know, so communities are led to believe that development will be done by those organizations who are funded. These aren't our organizations. And I think this is sort of where the rubber hits the road, is somehow financing, innovative or not, has somehow ended up alienating CSOs from the communities they are meant to serve. And I think that is a critical issue that we should be looking at in all of this, is what are we trying to leave in place here? How do external resources help build the ecosystem that actually people want? And how do we actually not insist only on measuring the money that comes in from outside and the priorities that come in from outside, but actually have a more equitable conversation about the different kinds of inputs and such like. And so we know, for example, trust is a currency that local actors can build through demonstration. So local philanthropy is a brilliant way to demonstrate trust, because if I've given my money, I sure as hell want to know it's been spent. So it creates a sweet kind of accountability within a community to start demonstrating kind of transparent, accountable practices as verified and accepted by communities, rather than just ticking the boxes of international funders. And I think it's that kind of blending that we insist only on one system mattering more. But actually, when you really speak to effective local civil society organizations who have constituencies for their work, who have local people giving them support, whether it's financial or moral, you know, they'll come along to the meeting, or they'll bring the tea or whatever, or they'll give on a regular basis. We actually, the strategies they use there, we barely kind of touch the surface of that. And that to me is the gold dust of actually building from the bottom up, rather than sort of imposing, you know, and creating new sort of, okay, this week you've got to learn this language and come back to us with this jargon kind of thing. So I think we sometimes look in the wrong places for wisdom, which is definitely there, which we've somehow we've diminished in terms of its value. We valued what fits into a dominant narrative, and we haven't really valued, my goodness, how on earth did you get 5,000 people to agree to give you $10 in a context where, you know, which is entirely aid dependent? And so I think we don't always look in the right places for the answers. And if we were able to kind of create conversations, dialogues with a more of an equitable approach, and again, with a focus on who is benefiting here. It's not just being able to demonstrate as an INGO or a funder that you delivered something. It really is the extent to which this is having an impact on communities and what matters to them and the change that they see and they validate. So I think we're as a, you know, we keep feeding in new products. We're not very good at having systems and ecosystems conversations and appreciating that not all knowledge exists out, you know, in the global north and must be imported. I think we still insist on that. And I think the experience in Ukraine with Ukrainian NGOs saying, don't come and build our capacity according to what you think it should look like to spend your money. We have capacity and we've got something to teach you too. I think that sort of, those kinds of conversations need to be had and encouraged in a much more open way, because it just, we're sort of missing each other at the moment along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Elina, please.
Yeah, I think that's a really, these are all really critical points, Jenny. I think it makes me kind of think, you know, one thing that's important for me to recognize is that innovative finance is just a tool, right? It requires our direction. And to me, there's nothing intrinsic about innovative finance that would sort of lend itself to driving more locally led development. To me, it's sort of all in the design, right? Like, how are we actually designing these instruments? So I think that's really important to highlight, that innovative finance is just a tool, and it can go in kind of either directions. I do think, because we were kind of on the topic of results-based financing, you know, and it's an area that I have some expertise in. I do feel like there are certain design features that kind of make it more or less likely that the vehicle will actually lead to more or drive more locally driven development. So one, and I think Chidi, you kind of started to allude to this, one is just risk transfer. So one of the main reasons why donors, to me, focus so much on compliance and reporting and accounting is that's the only thing they can control, right? They can't control the final outcome or result, but ultimately they carry most of the financial risk. So if a program doesn't achieve the outcomes, then, you know, that money's gone. So to prevent that from happening, they invest a lot of time and resources into kind of like micromanaging, you know, budget line items. And so results-based financing changes that dynamic by shifting financial risk away from the donor to the implementing agency, and thereby not caring as much like how does the money spent, but actually what does that money achieve? And I think to Chidi's point, there's a question of like, how do you, you know, build the capacity of organizations to actually manage that risk, which is kind of a separate question and an important one. The other one is co-creation. I think that is a design feature. So because implementers are now under results-based financing contracts are taking on some of the financial risks, they get a seat at the table, right? In a way that they kind of don't in a traditional grant, because it's sort of this one-sided exchange, right? I've worked with, over 30 NGOs at this point, trying to assess their capacity to engage in RBF mechanisms. And it's really not uncommon for me to ask, okay, you've been running this program for 10 years, like, how do you define success? And their response is, well, it depends on the donor. This donor had this priority and they gave us this measurement framework, and you multiply that by like 5 donors and it just turns really messy. RBF basically focuses on agreeing on what is it that we're trying to achieve, right? To your point, Jenny, what is that result? And the implementing agency is actually a really integral part of figuring that out in an RBF contract. Actually, to me, the success or failure of an RBF is a function of, like, did you co-create it together, or is this something that the donor just kind of brought and hey, results weren't achieved, right? So that's a really important part of it. And then the third lever, I think, of RBF is enhanced data measurement and tracking. And I know, Charlie, you talked about this a little bit in the context of NEF. When we talk about strengthening local capacity, a lot of times what we're really talking about is capacity to manage funding in a compliant way, right? We're talking about compliance. We're not really talking about organizations' capacity to actually deliver meaningful results to their constituents. And so a lot of the information that implementers are asked to collect is actually pretty useless in terms of like actual programmatic decision making. And so RBF also changes that dynamic, right? You have a very focused set of payment triggers that have to be achieved to get paid. And then the focus of the data collection and the monitoring shifts from one of compliance to one of learning, right? What are the critical pieces of information that we need to know to actually be able to determine if our program is working or not? So I think those 3 levers are really important, but it's not intrinsic to RBF. I think it's sort of, you have to build it into the design.
Thank you, Elina. Charlie, you've got your hand up.
Took me a while to find the button to raise my hand here, but so I don't want to take things far afield here, but I think in innovative finance, partially in terms of, impact bonds, blended finance, things like this, but also in terms of social entrepreneurship. And some of the most exciting work that I've seen in terms of empowering and local organizations, that's not the right word, but helping them gain autonomy in their programming and financing is through social entrepreneurship. And there's some great examples of organizations who generate their own revenue, sometimes 100% of their operating and programming costs, through businesses that either serve a social good, generate funding to invest in their social work, provide employment, or meet needs in other ways. So, the Near East Foundation has been involved in several, again, I don't know if this is innovative financing, but I think that the financial mechanism at a local level, to me, is very powerful and innovative. But, organizations so Near East Foundation has been involved in projects. It's a project funding, grant-based funding, but what the purpose of this was to help community-based organizations, local organizations, develop financial autonomy through revenue generation. And happy to say a little bit more about that and hear from others as well. But I do want to give a shout out to that. It's not just about complex international funding mechanisms with the involvement of donor agencies. Sometimes it's bootstrapping, but it's possible to achieve significant scale with this.
Thanks, Charlie. I think one thing that we've been hearing you all mention is the idea that in all of this, we need to be thinking about not just the creation of an instrument, in a boardroom somewhere that then is plopped down within a community or with an implementer, but really the idea that there has to be full participation throughout all the phases of thinking this through. And I think, Elina, you referred to co-creation. Co-creation is a really, I think, critical step towards effective locally led development and enabling environments for locally led development, because it actually has the people living and most closely affected to the challenges that are being addressed, participating in or hopefully driving the design of the solutions. Let me circle back to Chidi and ask you about, from what's been said, any reactions, and then also how you might be also, you've talked about strengthening the capacity of the organization so that they are at a trusted level, and wondering also how you may be looking at or thinking about co-creation as part of the way that you're approaching this.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Quite insightful. My notebook is filled with so many ideas I need to explore further. Just to add or contribute to this, something else we've also been exploring, back home as well, is democratizing giving and including the MSMEs and the small businesses, who are looking to make a difference. They reach out to us consistently and say, look, we want to make a difference. We want to do something. They might not be able to access $100 million in financing, or may be able to reel out that amount of money at a national level, but they are making enough profits to support the SDGs, especially locally driven, activities. So one of the ways is, we have also helped them to achieve that, is to also make sure that they realize that, look, if you assign XYZ amount of your budget or your profit every month to these nonprofits, actually goes a long way. When a nonprofit knows that, let's say, for lack of a better example, maybe $1,000 or $5,000 is guaranteed every month from these nonprofits, which just looking to contribute to the work that they are doing, it does go a long way in sustaining the nonprofit as well as sustaining the initiatives that they are running. And then they get a report, they get to see how the little financing is making a difference in the work of this nonprofit. So that's another way we've been exploring, just tapping into the MSME market and the small business market that currently exists, and providing that avenue for both the nonprofits and the MSMEs to make a difference. So that's why I really love what Elina said about co-creating, just letting them see that it's not always the big monies that make the difference, that sometimes it's a collection of the smaller figures that does make an impact, especially if we are clear about the why or the what we were giving to. This is why we are giving, this is a change we want to see. Then it becomes a lot more easier for these organizations to co-create with the nonprofits and just get the results that they are looking to get at the end of the day. So that's just what I would love to add in terms of what other ideas we've been playing around with back home.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's so important. And, Humentum published research at the end of March on the starvation cycle of funders to national and local organizations. And the idea that, funders frequently ask organizations to undertake work and then don't pay for the full and fair cost of what that work will cost the organization. And that means that organizations not only don't have the money to do what they've been contracted to do, but they also don't have any money available for building their reserves, for making strategic investments, for building the capacity of and strengthening the capacity of their staff and their systems, and that they have to shortchange the operations side of the way that they work because they don't have the funding to actually implement what they are doing on the mission side of the organization. And so this idea of having some sort of a guaranteed income for nonprofits, even if it's small, is a great one. I see here in the comment of something from Save the Children about putting in money, including money in grants for CSO strategic plans. We encourage and have made calls to action around the idea that anybody in a funding organization, whether it is a traditional funder or whether it's an intermediary organization that then funds to smaller organizations, really should be looking at what is the full and fair cost that they should be covering. And on top of that, thinking about, can they add a surplus that is going to that organization for use either in building unrestricted reserves and or building systems and capabilities within the organization to make it a stronger organization overall. I wanted to drop in the idea of Mackenzie Scott. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with her, but she is a billionaire in the United States who over the last couple of years has been giving small to very large, completely unrestricted grants to organizations. The organizations do not apply for them. She has people working to vet and evaluate organizations, and then they are informed that they have received this money, and it is no strings attached money. And I think that she, through her actions, has created a lot of interesting discussion around the idea of no strings attached funding. And she has, I'm not sure how much she uses the language around trust, because they're not actually doing any formal sort of due diligence or vetting of the organizations ahead of time, at least that the organizations are participating in. But it's really just, here's a check, go do your work. And I saw somebody in the chat say, what are the radical ways of funding the work? And for me, that is a pretty radical way, because it is hard for a funder to say, we think you do good work, just do it. It is hard to give up that control. And I think so much of the way that our sector is structured, it is around power, it is around control. And we dress it up by talking about accountability, we dress it up by talking about stewardship and things like that. But in fact, it's really about, I have this idea and I want to control you to actually get you to do what I want you to do. So let me hand that to Jenny and have you comment on that. So I think you're looking at it very much from a community perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say Mackenzie Scott is a great innovative financing mechanism, and that kind of change from within, that push to say, actually, you're creating these structures really as a way to kind of, it's about ego, and I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of philanthropy is about ego and having things reflected back to one. And for those of us who work in a sector which is around the transfer of money, it's a sector where this sort of stuff can easily go to one's head without the best will in the world kind of thing. But I think if you hold that kind of disruption from the sort of supply side, from the resource end, maybe I could just share a couple of examples of what I think of our innovative financing mechanisms that are coming out of the emergent side of the system. And one is in Nepal and one is in Uganda, and I'll try to be brief, but in Nepal, TEWA, the Nepal Women's Fund, has been around for more than 25 years. Nepal is one of the most aid-dependent countries in the world. So the idea that you could build local philanthropy there has seemed, and continue to many who don't know TEWA, seems bonkers. But really the approach that Rita Tapa, the founder, and there have been two subsequent leadership transitions took, was that of innovative financing. She understood that there was a donor interest in women's rights, so it's a women's fund. But she also saw the opportunity to build community sense of agency and ownership by encouraging the local giving within Nepal, and to encourage Nepalis to feel responsible and like they had some agency in driving their country's development. So TEWA for many years used international money to kind of fund its operations. As a grant-making fund, in the first 15 years of their operations, any money they raised locally, that was the only money that they used to support women's groups. All their grant making was done through money that was raised locally, because they wanted to demonstrate that that was possible. So international money was used to kind of support the whole thing, but the actual work was to show the sort of circularity of this is what happens when you pool resources collectively and the kind of change it can bring about. So it was about kind of sparking an innovation within Nepal, which was the sense of people's agency and the potential of what happens when people can kind of come together and collaborate in that kind of a way. They also encourage in some of their international funders, once they had a bit more of a track record and can see that this model worked, to help build a conference center. So their office and has so they have a kind of social enterprise there where they can make money off that too. But it was a very sophisticated model from the start, which you directed the resources to do the thing that only they could do and should do. But you held the whole thing together in that way. Now that's quite a mature model, a complete trailblazer. You know, for many years, the idea, yes, even now, the idea of giving money within Nepal is to many just seems sort of crazy. But what TEWA does too is when they make grants to women's groups, they encourage some of those groups to contribute, all of those groups to contribute something back to the fund, not because it's not a grant, but it is to kind of flatten power, to say you can be a recipient, but you can also be a donor. This is your fund, it has supported you, but you also own it. And I think those sorts of behavior changes, which again are very difficult to program from outside, but when you have strong community leaders who understand how to build these kinds of are eminently possible. The other one I'll just mention briefly is in Uganda. An organization, and I'm sure they won't mind us talking about them, we describe them on our website, the Twernoaho Listeners Club, doesn't fit into any of the categories or silos that would please most funding structures. They're a human rights organization that runs a community radio station that works with communities to fight land right claims against the World Bank, the government, land grabbing kind of cases. They encourage the communities they work with to contribute to some of the legal work that they do. And the strategy behind that is to get them to realize as communities that they have agency. They don't have to wait for someone to give them money and then permission to act in the courts. So that the local giving dimension of that is about activating communities. Part of it also resources the work, but it's not about just resourcing the work. In Uganda, obviously, there's a real context of shrinking space, deep hostility, demonization of civil society. And so human rights organizations, you don't want to put that at the front of your business card right now. So they've also done some really clever work. During the pandemic, they started doing some fundraising work, for the local football team, because they thought, everyone loves the local football team. If we can be associated with a larger public good, so people might not like human rights, but they sure as hell like football. So we start to sort of create a space where these different pathways of community radio as the place of dissemination, the kind of the rights work around land grabbing, the sense that football, you can be a human rights activist and play football kind of thing. And so using kind of innovative ways, pathways, breadcrumbs to bring people and resources together in different ways. And the purpose of it is to make something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, it doesn't sit easily in a linear program approach, because you've got football, you've got radio, you've got human rights, all this sort of stuff. But I think those sorts of, and those you can't plan around, they don't fit easily into log frames. And yet they are the things where real, leaders see opportunities to innovate and to bring people in and are ready and nimble and poised to be able to do so, and have the resources to be able to do that. So I think sometimes it's that we miss the sort of real narrative of some of these stories, because we're so insistent on fitting into kind of rigid frameworks. It's the non-linearity of social change and the trusting people to know how to navigate the systems and structures in which they work, at what time and in what ways, that I think is so kind of powerful, and we really have so much to learn from.
Thanks, Jenny. Let me go back to Charlie, and maybe I'm picking on you, Charlie, because I know more about the work that you've done over the years. But I keep thinking about this idea of bridging, and we've got thought going into innovative financing instruments, and it's got this complex language and these complex ideas, and that are impenetrable to a lot of us. And then we've got the community, the recognition of how important it is to be doing design and accountability and leadership from the community level to really make locally led development happen and create that enabling environment. And how do we bridge between working both with the locally led development engine and perspective and bringing in some of these ideas that are being developed at a, let's say, a more global level, but that kind of just still remain impenetrable and difficult to connect the two pieces. What are your thoughts about that?
Let me
A simple question.
Yeah, well, so I think that I'm trying to think of some specific examples. So I feel there's a lot of bridging that needs to happen in a lot of different ways. So one is among, with these more complex mechanisms among diverse partners, right? And I remember one of my first conversations with an impact investor, and he was talking about our pipeline. And for me, a pipeline was our proposals that were in preparation. And so he said, you got a really strong pipeline. And that he was referring to the businesses that they could invest in Jordan in this case. So he was looking at investment ready businesses as a venture capitalist, right? So I feel that I like the business approach to things, because I think, and as evidenced by my shout out to social enterprise, I think that the more that you can build models that put resources in the hands of entities that are as close to communities as possible is good. And I think of Near East Foundation's work with devolved climate funds. Jenny, you were talking about the climate crisis and getting resources close to the people who are on the frontline communities. We did work in Mali and in Senegal, the idea was to create an institutional mechanism and communities and skills so that global climate funds could be channeled as close as possible. In this case, at a sub-regional level in Mali and Senegal, and then to prepare these entities, including the national governments, to access global finance, global adaptation funds themselves, and program them in a way that put local communities in charge in terms of understanding climate adaptation, prioritizing, designing interventions, and so on. So there's still accountability mechanisms that, the compliance aspect of things that need to be attended to. Those can be attended to by national governments, regional governments, and then let the local communities and their representatives figure out how they want to use this money and to prioritize investments in adaptation. Even the way that they define adaptation, and that was a big part of this, is like resilience. We have ideas about resilience. So the starting point for this work was going to communities and figuring out, how do they define resilience? What is a resilient household? I think in terms of the work that the Near East Foundation has been doing in Jordan, working with community-based organizations to serve refugee communities and their host communities through small business development. And this I mentioned earlier that where does it start? Where do these conversations start? And they, to me, a lot of them start with, how do you take a project that's time bound with a specific budget, with deliverables and results expectations, and create the resource base and the skills and structures so that can continue in the hands of the CBOs themselves. And one of the major ways that we did that, well, there are two ways. First of all, we created a micro-franchised approach to organizing a community-based livelihoods hub. Right? So it's organized as a micro franchise. In a sense, there's standard operating procedures. All can be adapted, but there's a basis for a community-based organization to quickly start up a livelihoods center. The other was to put in place community-based credit funds that our local partners, the community-based organizations had control over, within a structure that had been defined together, to make their own decisions about what businesses they'll fund, how they'll, so they have control over the resources. They have a model that they can use to and adapt, and a network that they can plug into to share their experience and do problem solving. And in the case of Jordan, these community-based credit funds, which are different than microfinance, are more flexible. They can provide grace periods, flexibility in reimbursement, come under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Social Development rather than the Ministry of Finance. So and I will say that these are some of the same partners in the same structure that are the kind of local partners of the Development Impact Bond. So it represents a point in evolution of getting money to local partners that they can program, in a way that is effective and adaptive and so on. So I think that these complex mechanisms, the blended finance, the impact bonds, need to be structured in a way that provide that flexibility to local communities. That's one way of bridging. And maybe I'll another way. I'll go back to social enterprises. There is potential for project-based, grant-based work to create the circumstances for community-based organizations and local and national organizations to thrive, and become financially, at least partially autonomous, so they can do the work that they prioritize based on the understandings of community needs that they have, without being beholden at all to an international donor. For the role that an international NGO can play, and I saw the reference to the strategic planning in the comments, is actually another kind of plan, a business plan. It's not building capacity, but it's working with an organization to put in place a business plan that makes financial sense from a business perspective, that will generate not only break even, but resources to advance different aspects of their social work. And I think if I can just give one example of the Emerging Business Factory in Marrakesh in Morocco, this is a group that was essentially a co-working space. It's a business. They were a beneficiary of a project that we implemented with funding from the State Department. One of the first things we did was to help them develop a business plan that helped them reach break even. And we helped them do this by diversifying the services that they offered, by increasing their visibility through networking events, so strengthening the business ecosystem in Marrakesh, increasing the traffic at their co-working space, and in parallel creating, and this is something that happened independent of our work, creation of the EBF, Emerging Business Factory, which is an English language name, even in Morocco, EBF Foundation, that was funded by the business to do more social development work that one would associate with an NGO. The other thing that I think, another example in Marrakesh, and I'll end it quickly, the Pikala bikes. It's a social enterprise. It's comprised, because of the regulatory environment in Morocco, as a business, tax-paying business, as a foundation, a community-based foundation or association, and there's a European branch as well. They operate bicycle tours, bicycle mechanics training, bicycle repairs, and they use the money to fund bicycle safety classes in schools, courses for girls to learn how to ride bicycles that overcome some social stigma in the area. During COVID, and I think this is one of the things that I've been was most impressed with there, is that they were able to adapt. There weren't tours coming to Marrakesh, but they were able to pivot, and they provided delivery services during lockdown. They did awareness campaigns during, around COVID. And what I think that shows to me is that it's an adaptable model that puts the power in the hands of the organizations who are doing the work, who can respond to needs that are outside of any kind of project framework.
Thank you, Charlie. I think that was really useful to get a couple of really concrete examples. And I'm just going to call out, because I've heard this, you've just used these terms, but they've really been used throughout what we've been discussing today, is adaptation, flexibility, agility, the idea that, meeting organizations, meeting communities where they are, having co-creation and design, as well as implementation, accountability, all really focused from or evolving from, and then focused on that level closest to the community. We are almost out of time, so I am going to go ask each speaker to just give us, a 1 minute. Are you optimistic about this? Is there something? What is your key takeaway? And if you, we've had a couple of people say, what are the best practices? What should we take away? If there's one takeaway that you have that we should all bring with us after this session, it would be great to hear from you. So I'm going to go from the bottom of my screen up. So I'm going to start with Jenny.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I mean, I think I agree with Elina. This isn't about tools. You can use tools to do good things, and you can do tools to do bad things, and tools to do mediocre things. This is about values. This is about the shared aspiration, the complex nature of the problems that we're dealing with, and the need to be able to bring together the different resources and parts of the system to work collaboratively to build something new. And I think, we sometimes get stuck in the detail of the what rather than the why. And so I think for me, it's like the right people in the right spaces coming together for the right conversation is what's going to lead to more effective community-led development. And tools are just tools.
Awesome, thank you. That's a great takeaway. Charlie, you're next. What's your takeaway?
Yeah, so I'm very optimistic about it. I like the conversations. I like the innovation. I like the problem solving. I like, partners talking together, trying to find new solutions to, to these wicked problems. I feel that, from the perspective of international NGOs, local NGOs, any NGOs, kind of getting off the, grants are great. They allow us to do really interesting work with well-designed projects, but it's a little bit of a treadmill. You've got a time-bound project, start, end, targets, budget. What I think is that partners at all levels, I include local organizations, there, international organizations, donors, are looking for new ways of doing business. So I think that there's a sense of innovation and entrepreneurship that is only going to result in good new ideas. I also think that it begs the question of what's the value added of an international organization, right? When we're trying to empower, or not again, so if we're trying to put power or whatever resources in the hands of local organizations, shift the power balance. What is it that international NGOs are going to do? And I think that there's a lot that they can do, and part of it is in the innovation, the being a good partner, But I think that redefining that role is going to come out of, it's going to be a part of what comes out of this discussion. So we're trying to redefine our role as well.
Yeah, thank you. Really, that's really important. Elina.
I'm also optimistic. I think innovative finance isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay. And if anything, it's going to grow. So NGOs, my recommendation would be to get curious, start, learning about these different instruments and starting to think about like how it fits into your work. But we are kind of in a steady state. We're sort of plateaued. And I think to get to the next level, we need to be thinking about how to build ecosystems around some of these mechanisms. So that's going to be critical to kind of see massive scale.
Great,
Hi.
thank you. And
I'm Abdi from Somalia. I can see I'm in a great window of opportunity. I think we can do a lot, but we have to be very committed to make a difference.
Thank you, Abdi, and thank you for your comments in the chat. That's great. I want to make sure to give Chidi time to give us her takeaway. So I'm going to switch to her. Chidi?
Thank you all so much. So I would just say, to the nonprofits in the room, your sustainability cannot be dependent on external grants and external funding for the long term. You need to really start thinking, like Elina said, about what are other innovative ways of redesigning your programs in such a way that they are self-sufficient, can internally generate your own funding, and you can continue to scale up the impact of your work. Let the external grants be a plus, but let that not be the defining, let it not define the sustainability of the work that you're doing. And then I would also say to any of the funders in the room, it's also important that we begin to rethink some of the things or some of the strategies we have deployed over the years. Some of them are sadly no longer as relevant as we had done, or it had been 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So many things have changed in so short a time. So it might be great to really redefine how you are redesigning some of your funding mechanisms, and to also always consider the operational costings for some of these nonprofits. When they deploy their work on the field, there is a huge operational cost that comes to the nonprofits that are sometimes being shied away by the funding agencies. So I think co-creation would always be the best approach to sustaining our financing in the sector. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Chidi. And I have to say, I love that we end on the idea of co-creation. And I think for me, I have so many takeaways from this discussion. Thank you all for such a dynamic conversation. And really, I think what I'm going to take away is typically, I think we hear about innovative financing and we think these big mechanisms. And in fact, it can be something very rooted in community. It can be a return to community solidarity and mutuality, as Jenny discussed. That can be innovative because it's being used in innovative ways, or it's being given value and new kinds of value to create results that sometimes we can't get with those larger approaches. So thank you all. We are out of time. I know that we could have kept this going for quite some time more, and I will look forward to seeing all of the discussions that come out of this. Just to remind everybody, our final webinar in this series for 2022 will take place on November 2nd, so please plan to join us then. We will be releasing more information from this event. So we usually have a follow-up blog and some other information that will be coming out. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who's contributed through the chat with your comments and thoughts. And thank you to all of you for choosing to spend your time with us today. Looking forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks, and onward.